Terrence and Zoe Jackson, two well-dressed African-American teenagers, being forcibly removed from first-class seats on United Airlines Flight 1143 to San Francisco. Flight attendant Melanie Ward insisting they don't belong there despite their protests. Security approaching as a distinguished black man boards last minute. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed discrimination in public, and subscribe to hear more stories about standing up against injustice. Now, let's find out how these teenagers' morning started before everything went wrong. The alarm clock buzzed at exactly 5:30 a.m. in Terrence Jackson's spacious bedroom. The 17-year-old reached over and silenced it with a practiced motion, already fully awake. Today was important. The Stanford summer tech program he and his sister had been accepted to was finally starting. He swung his legs over the side of his king-sized bed and gazed out the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Houston mansion, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Terrence. You up?" His 15-year-old sister Zoe's voice came through the intercom system. Unlike her older brother who was meticulously punctual, Zoe was surprisingly chipper in the mornings. "Yeah, heading to shower," he replied, pressing the intercom button. "Dad still in his meeting? Hasn't come out of his office since 3 a.m. "Some crisis with the Tokyo servers," Zoe answered. "I'm making smoothies. Want one?" This was typical of their father, Darius Jackson. As founder and CEO of DJX Innovations, one of the world's leading tech companies specializing in cloud security solutions, crisis management was part of his normal routine. Worth an estimated $8 billion, Darius Jackson had come from nothing, growing up in Detroit's toughest neighborhoods, to build a tech empire. Yet despite their immense wealth, he insisted on raising his children with strong values, work ethic, and a deep understanding of responsibility. Terrence showered quickly and dressed in dark jeans, a simple blue button-down shirt, and low-key sneakers that cost more than most people's monthly rent but didn't advertise their price tag. Their father had taught them both the importance of being presentable without flaunting wealth. "Your character speaks louder than your clothes ever will," was one of Darius's favorite sayings. Downstairs in their gleaming kitchen that looked straight out of an architectural magazine, Zoe was indeed making smoothies. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple yellow sundress with white sneakers. "Mom called from London," Zoe mentioned, pushing a green smoothie toward her brother. "The foundation's water purification project is going well. She says she misses us and to send pics from Stanford." Their mother, Alicia Jackson, was a former human rights attorney who now ran the Jackson Family Foundation, focusing on clean water initiatives in developing countries. She'd been in London for a conference before heading to Africa to oversee projects firsthand. "Did you pack the project prototypes?" Terrence asked, sipping his smoothie. "All safely in my carry-on. The solar charger, the water testing kit, and the mesh network nodes," Zoe replied. She was already following in their father's innovative footsteps, having developed a low-cost water contamination detection system at just 15. They both turned as their father's office door finally opened. Darius Jackson, at 43, was an imposing figure, 6'3" with broad shoulders, closely cropped hair with distinguished gray at the temples, and eyes that seemed to calculate 1,000 things at once. Despite being awake for over 24 hours, he looked immaculate in a tailored navy suit. "Morning, you two," he said, his deep voice warm despite his obvious exhaustion. "Ready for Stanford?" "All packed and ready," Terrence confirmed. "How's the Tokyo situation?" "Contained for now," Darius said, accepting the coffee Zoe handed him. "But I need to go back for another call in 15 minutes. That's why I booked you both on the earlier flight. I'll catch the afternoon one and meet you in San Francisco by dinner." "We could wait and all go together," Zoe suggested. Darius shook his head. "No need. You've both flown alone plenty of times. The program orientation is at 4, and I want you settled in comfortably before then." He took a sip of coffee and studied his children. I've arranged for first-class tickets. Travel comfortably, but remember. We know, Dad, both teenagers said in unison. Then Terrence continued their father's familiar refrain, privilege isn't for flaunting, it's a responsibility. Darius smiled. Exactly. And speaking of responsibility, take an Uber to the airport instead of calling the driver. I want you navigating real-world situations independently. Even though we're flying first class. Zoe raised an eyebrow. The class you fly isn't about showing off. It's about practical comfort for a 6-hour flight where you'll both be working on your program proposals, Darius explained. There's a difference between utilizing resources wisely and flashing wealth unnecessarily. As they finished breakfast, Darius received another call and had to return to his office. Before leaving, he hugged both his children tightly. I'm proud of you both, he said. Remember who you are and what our family stands for. The Jackson name means excellence, integrity, and lifting others as you climb. After he disappeared back into his office, Terrence and Zoe finished packing their carry-ons. Despite having access to virtually unlimited funds, both carried modest luggage, high quality but not ostentatious. Do you ever think about how different our lives are from Dad's when he was our age? Zoe asked as they waited for their Uber in the circular driveway of their estate. He was working 2 jobs and taking care of his sick mother when he was your age. Terrence nodded thoughtfully. That's why he's so big on us understanding privilege. He doesn't want us taking anything for granted. Like making us take public transportation sometimes and volunteer at the shelter every month, Zoe added. And making us start at entry-level positions in the company during summers, with the same pay as anyone else, Terrence continued. Their conversation paused as the Uber arrived, a standard Toyota Camry. The driver, a middle-aged man named Harold, seemed momentarily surprised when he realized his pickup was at one of Houston's most exclusive addresses, but the teenager's friendly demeanor quickly put him at ease. As they drove toward Houston International Airport, Terrence and Zoe continued their conversation about privilege and responsibility. Despite attending an exclusive private school and living in luxury, both were remarkably grounded. They participated in normal teenage activities. Terrence played basketball and ran track, while Zoe was involved in debate club and coding competitions. Both volunteered regularly and had traveled extensively for both pleasure and philanthropic work with their parents. I'm excited about the Stanford program, Zoe said as they approached the airport. Do you think Dad will let us develop our projects through DJX if they turn out well? You know Dad, he'll make us go through the same proposal process as anyone else, Terrence chuckled. But he'll give honest feedback. They arrived at the airport with plenty of time to spare. Thanking Harold, they grabbed their luggage and walked into the bustling terminal without the entourage of security or assistants that typically accompanied high-profile wealthy families. Just as their father intended, they looked like ordinary, well-dressed teenagers heading for a flight, their extraordinary background invisible to casual observers. Little did they know that this practiced normalcy was about to be severely tested, as assumptions and prejudices lurked just ahead at the check-in counter. The Houston International Airport bustled with typical morning activity as Terrence and Zoe approached the United Airlines premium check-in counter. With fewer people in line, they reached the counter quickly, where a middle-aged white man with a name tag reading, Brian Miller, greeted them with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Good morning, Terrence said politely, placing their IDs and flight information on the counter. We're checking in for flight 1143 to San Francisco. Brian's eyes flicked between the teenagers and their documentation, his smile faltering slightly. First class, he asked, emphasizing the words in a way that made it sound like a question that shouldn't need asking. Yes, Zoe confirmed with a pleasant smile, not yet picking up on his tone. I see, Brian said, typing into his computer with unnecessary force. And, who purchased these tickets? Terrence's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered this particular brand of skepticism. Our father, he answered evenly. And is your father traveling with you today? Brian continued, still not processing their check-in. He's on a later flight, Terrence explained, maintaining his composure. We're traveling to San Francisco for a program at Stanford. Something in the mention of Stanford made Brian hesitate, reassessing the teenagers before him. I'll need to see your payment card, he finally said. We don't have the payment card. Our father booked the tickets through his executive account, Terrence explained. Everything should be noted in the reservation. Brian sighed as if this was creating an enormous inconvenience for him. Let me check with my supervisor, he said, stepping away from the counter. Zoe leaned toward her brother. Is there a problem with our tickets? She whispered. No, Terrence replied quietly. There's a problem with how we look. Understanding dawned on Zoe's face just as Brian returned with another employee, a woman with a supervisor badge named Patricia Wells. She reviewed their information more professionally. Everything seems to be in order, Patricia confirmed, shooting Brian a pointed look. Mr. Jackson is a United Global Services member. She efficiently processed their check-in and handed them their boarding passes. Enjoy your flight, and please give your father our regards. As they walked away from the counter, Zoe muttered, that was weird. That was a microaggression, Terrence corrected. First of probably many today. His prediction proved accurate when they reached the security checkpoint. Despite having TSA pre-check, both teenagers were directed to the full screening line instead. When Terrence politely pointed out the pre-check designation on their boarding passes, the TSA agent, a stocky man named Doug Peterson, barely glanced at them. Random selection for additional screening, he stated flatly, pointing them toward the regular line. From their position, Terrence and Zoe could clearly see white passengers with pre-check being ushered through the expedited lane without issue. Neither teenager commented on this, having been taught by their parents how to navigate these situations with dignity. The random, additional screening turned out to be particularly thorough. Doug insisted on examining every item in their carry-ons, questioning Zoe extensively about her water testing prototype components. What's this for? He demanded, holding up one of the sealed testing tubes. It's part of a water quality assessment kit for my research project, Zoe explained patiently. The chemicals are all non-toxic and within approved quantities for air travel. Doug frowned, clearly looking for a reason to confiscate the items, but eventually found none. Meanwhile, Terrence was subjected to an additional pat-down that seemed unnecessarily thorough. When they finally cleared security, both siblings took a moment to compose themselves near a seating area. That was definitely not random, Zoe said, her voice tight with contained frustration. Deep breath, Terrence reminded her, using one of their father's techniques. We know who we are. Their assumptions are about them, not us. With over an hour before boarding, they decided to get coffee at an airport cafe. Standing in line at the busy coffee shop, Zoe placed their order when they reached the counter, 2 iced coffees and a pastry to share. The barista, Karen Wilson according to her name tag, nodded without making eye contact, then proceeded to serve the white businessman who had arrived after them. Excuse me, Terrence said politely. We were next. Karen glanced at them with barely concealed annoyance. I didn't hear your order. We ordered 2 iced coffees and a chocolate croissant, Zoe repeated, her voice calm but firm. Karen reluctantly took their order, muttering something under her breath that neither teenager could quite catch. As they waited for their drinks, Zoe's composed demeanor began to crack. How do you stay so calm? She whispered to her brother. This is infuriating. I've had 3 more years of practice, Terrence replied quietly. Dad says it's like a tax we pay just for existing in certain spaces. It's not fair, but getting visibly angry only reinforces their stereotypes. But we're literally just standing here, buying coffee, existing, Zoe said. Which is exactly what some people find threatening, Terrence replied, accepting their drinks from the counter where Karen had placed them without a word. As they found seats in the cafe, an elderly white woman with silver hair approached their table. Both siblings tensed slightly, expecting another unpleasant interaction, but were surprised when she smiled warmly. Excuse me, she said. I couldn't help noticing you too. Are you heading to college visits? My granddaughter just started at Berkeley. We're actually going to a summer program at Stanford, Zoe answered, relaxing slightly at the woman's genuine friendliness. Oh, how wonderful. I'm Clara Henderson, heading to San Francisco to visit my son. She chatted with them pleasantly for a few minutes about their interests and studies, treating them with the natural respect that had been notably absent in their previous interactions. When they eventually headed to their gate, Terrence and Zoe felt somewhat restored by the simple experience of being treated normally. However, their relief was short-lived when they approached the gate agent, Thomas Reynolds, to inquire about the boarding time. First class. Thomas repeated when they mentioned their seating, looking them up and down with unconcealed doubt. Let me see your boarding passes again. After inspecting their passes with unnecessary scrutiny, he reluctantly confirmed they were indeed in first class and would be in the first boarding group. You'd think we were trying to sneak into the White House, not just sitting in seats our dad paid for, Zoe whispered as they moved away from the counter. Terrence checked his phone, seeing a text from their father asking if everything was going smoothly. After a moment's consideration, he replied that everything was fine. There was no need to worry their father over situations they'd been taught to handle themselves. As boarding time approached, they lined up in the priority boarding area, acutely aware of the curious and sometimes disapproving glances from other first-class passengers. An older white couple nearby whispered to each other while looking in their direction, and a businessman in an expensive suit actually checked his boarding pass and frowned, as if concerned he might be in the wrong line upon seeing them. Just ignore them, Terrence advised his sister quietly. We belong here just as much as anyone else. Zoe nodded, straightening her posture and lifting her chin slightly, a move she'd unconsciously adopted from their mother, who always said, never let them see you doubt yourself. Little did either of them know that this philosophy would be put to an extreme test once they actually boarded the plane. Right this way, said flight attendant Jennifer Brooks, a friendly woman in her 30s with a warm smile as she checked Terrence and Zoe's boarding passes at the plane entrance. First class is to your left. Seats 2A and 2B. The teenagers thanked her and made their way to the spacious first-class cabin. Zoe had flown first class many times but still couldn't help being impressed by the luxurious leather seats, ample legroom, and overall atmosphere of exclusivity. Terrence moved with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in this environment, stowing their carry-ons in the overhead compartments. Window or aisle, he asked his sister. Window, please, Zoe replied, sliding into seat 2A while Terrence took 2B beside her. Jennifer approached them with a professional smile. Can I get you anything before takeoff? Water, juice, or perhaps a sparkling beverage? Water would be great, thank you, Terrence said, while Zoe requested orange juice. As Jennifer went to fetch their drinks, Zoe pulled out her tablet to review her project notes for the Stanford program. Terrence, meanwhile, remained subtly vigilant, a habit he'd developed over years of experiencing how quickly comfortable situations could change for young black people in predominantly white spaces. The first-class cabin gradually filled with other passengers. Across the aisle sat Gregory Wilson, a middle-aged white businessman in a tailored suit who barely glanced at them as he settled in and immediately opened his laptop. In the row behind them was Sofia Martinez, a Latina fashion executive who smiled briefly at the teenagers before taking her seat. Everything seemed normal until about 20 minutes before takeoff, when a shift change brought a new flight attendant to the first-class cabin. Melanie Ward, a blonde woman in her 40s with a pinched expression, immediately scanned the cabin and frowned slightly when her eyes landed on Terrence and Zoe. Excuse me, she said, approaching them while the other passengers were still boarding. May I see your boarding passes? Terrence produced them from his phone screen, maintaining a polite expression despite the familiar sinking feeling in his stomach. This wasn't the first time they'd been questioned in situations where their presence was unexpected. Melanie examined the digital boarding passes with obvious skepticism. These are first-class seats, she stated, as if they might not be aware. Yes, ma'am, Terrence confirmed evenly. And you're sure you're in the right cabin, she pressed, her tone suggesting they must have made a mistake. "We're in the correct seats," Zoe said, her voice tighter than her brother's. "2A and 2B, as assigned." Melanie's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just a moment," she said, walking away toward the front of the cabin where lead flight attendant Frank Thompson was organizing service items. The siblings watched as Melanie engaged in an intense whispered conversation with Frank, repeatedly glancing in their direction. Frank, a balding man in his 50s, frowned and looked over at them with uncertainty. "They think we snuck in here," Zoe whispered to her brother. "Stay calm," Terrence advised, though he could feel his own heart rate increasing. "We have every right to be here." The flight attendants approached together, Frank taking the lead. "Excuse me," he said in a voice low enough not to attract attention but firm enough to convey authority. "There seems to be some confusion with the seating arrangements. Would you mind moving to economy class until we sort this out?" Terrence straightened in his seat, keeping his voice measured but resolute. "There's no confusion, sir. These are our assigned seats, as confirmed by the gate agent and your colleague who welcomed us aboard." Frank glanced at Melanie, who interjected, "It's unusual for unaccompanied minors to be seated in first class without an adult guardian." "We're not unaccompanied minors," Terrence corrected her. "I'm 17 and my sister is 15. We're experienced travelers, and our father, who purchased these tickets, will be joining us in San Francisco later today." "And who is your father?" Melanie asked with unmistakable skepticism. Before Terrence could answer, Sofia Martinez leaned forward from her seat behind them. "Excuse me, but why are you questioning these young people when you haven't asked to see anyone else's boarding passes?" Melanie turned to her with a tight smile. "Ma'am, we're just following procedure for..." "For what?" Sophia interrupted. "I've been flying first class for 15 years and have never seen anyone questioned like this once they're seated with valid boarding passes." Frank looked increasingly uncomfortable, but Melanie remained unmoved. "We have protocols for unusual situations," she insisted. "The only unusual situation I see is your treatment of these passengers," Sophia countered. Gregory Wilson across the aisle finally looked up from his laptop, watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort but remaining silent. Melanie's face flushed. "Sir," she addressed Frank, "I think we need to call security. This situation is becoming disruptive." "We're not being disruptive," Terrence stated firmly. "We're simply sitting in our assigned seats." Frank hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and common sense, but Melanie had already picked up the cabin phone. "Security to the first-class cabin, please," she said, her voice carrying through the now silent section. Several passengers began murmuring among themselves. Some pulled out phones and started recording discreetly, while others studiously looked away, pretending not to notice the unfolding scene. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared at the entrance to first class: Nathan Davis, a tall black man who surveyed the situation with careful neutrality, and Mike Rodriguez, a Hispanic officer who looked confused about why they'd been called. "What seems to be the problem?" Officer Davis asked professionally. Melanie immediately approached them. "These two are refusing to move to their correct seats," she explained, gesturing toward Terrence and Zoe. "They've become confrontational when asked to comply." "That's not true," Zoe protested, her composure finally cracking. "We have legitimate tickets for these seats. We've shown them multiple times." Officer Rodriguez moved closer to the teenagers. "Can I see your boarding passes, please?" Once again, Terrence displayed the digital passes on his phone. Officer Rodriguez examined them and then looked questioningly at the flight attendants. "These appear to be valid first-class boarding passes for this flight." "We believe there may have been a mistake in the booking system," Melanie insisted, unwilling to back down. By now, the confrontation had attracted attention from passengers still boarding through the main cabin, creating a bottleneck as people slowed to observe the scene. The atmosphere in first class had become tense and uncomfortable. "I don't understand," Terrence said, maintaining remarkable composure despite the humiliation of being publicly questioned. "We've shown valid tickets multiple times. What exactly is the issue here?" The unspoken answer hung in the air, obvious to everyone watching. The issue was that these two young black people didn't fit Melanie's image of who belonged in first class. Officer Davis seemed to recognize the situation for what it was. He exchanged a knowing glance with Officer Rodriguez before addressing Frank directly. "Sir, if these passengers have valid tickets for these seats, I'm not sure what security issue we're supposed to be addressing." Frank began to respond when a commotion at the front of the plane drew everyone's attention. A distinguished black man in an impeccably tailored suit had just boarded, and his presence immediately changed the energy in the cabin. Several passengers recognized him instantly, their expressions shifting from discomfort to surprise. The man's eyes locked onto the scene before him, his children surrounded by flight attendants and security officers, and his expression darkened with controlled fury. Darius Jackson had arrived, and everything was about to change. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin froze as Darius Jackson stood in the entrance, his commanding presence immediately drawing all eyes toward him. At 6'3" with broad shoulders and the unmistakable aura of power that comes from running an $8 billion tech empire, he was impossible to ignore. "What exactly is happening here?" he asked, his deep voice carrying the kind of authority that made even security officers straighten their posture. Before anyone could respond, Terrence called out, "Dad! They're trying to remove us from our seats." Darius moved forward with purposeful strides, his expression a masterclass in controlled anger. The cabin crew parted instinctively to make way for him. Officer Davis, recognizing Darius immediately, took a subtle step back. "Mr. Jackson," the security officer acknowledged with a respectful nod. Melanie Ward's face drained of color as recognition dawned. Darius Jackson wasn't just any passenger, his company, DJX Innovations, was featured in Fortune magazine just last month. His face had been on the cover. "These are your children?" Frank Thompson asked, his tone shifting dramatically from authority to deference. "Yes," Darius confirmed, placing a protective hand on Zoe's shoulder. "My son and daughter, who apparently needed to defend their right to sit in seats I purchased." He turned his penetrating gaze to Melanie. "Would you care to explain why security has been called on my children?" Melanie stammered, "There was a misunderstanding about." "There was no misunderstanding," Darius cut her off sharply. "My children showed you valid tickets. They were seated correctly. The only misunderstanding was your assumption about who belongs in first class." The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the passengers still boarding through the main cabin had hushed, sensing the tension. Captain Stephen Phillips, alerted to the situation by another crew member, emerged from the cockpit. A veteran pilot in his 50s with graying temples, he assessed the scene quickly. "Mr. Jackson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Captain Phillips. I apologize for this situation. If you and your family would like to speak privately, we can use the forward galley." Darius shook the captain's hand firmly. "Thank you, Captain. But first, I believe these security officers were called here under false pretenses and should be released to attend to actual security concerns." Captain Phillips nodded to the officers. "Thank you, gentlemen. We can handle things from here." As Officers Davis and Rodriguez departed, several passengers who had been filming the incident on their phones continued recording. Gregory Wilson, the businessman across the aisle who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, now looked deeply uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with everyone. "Dad," Terrence said quietly, "it's okay. We can just continue the flight." Darius studied his son's face, noting the carefully controlled expression that masked the humiliation he must be feeling. He then looked at Zoe, whose eyes shimmered with unshed tears despite her attempt to appear strong. "No," Darius said firmly. "It's not okay. And we're going to address it properly." He turned to Captain Phillips. "I would appreciate that private conversation now." As they moved toward the galley, Sophia Martinez, who had attempted to defend the teenagers earlier, gave them an encouraging nod. Several other passengers now watched with newfound respect, having realized the teenagers they had dismissed were the children of one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in America. What do you think about the way Terrence and Zoe handled this situation before their father arrived? Comment number 1 if you believe they showed incredible restraint and maturity, or comment number 2 if you think they should have been more assertive in standing up for themselves. Hit that like button if you've ever had to maintain your composure in the face of discrimination, and subscribe to see more stories about navigating racial bias in everyday situations. Do you think Darius Jackson's arrival will bring justice, or will the airline try to sweep this incident under the rug? Let's find out what happens in that private conversation. The forward galley of the Boeing 787 wasn't designed for conferences, but it became one as Darius Jackson stood facing Captain Phillips, Frank Thompson, and a visibly uncomfortable Melanie Ward. The narrow space felt even more confined with the tension that filled it. "Let me be clear," Darius began, his voice measured but firm. "What happened today goes beyond poor customer service. It was a textbook example of racial profiling." Melanie immediately began to protest. "Sir, that's absolutely not." "Ms. Ward," Darius interrupted, his tone leaving no room for debate. "I run a company with over 5,000 employees. I've sat through enough HR meetings to recognize when someone is about to deny implicit bias rather than acknowledge it." Captain Phillips, a man accustomed to being the highest authority on his aircraft, recognized that in this particular situation, he needed to listen rather than command. "Mr. Jackson, on behalf of United Airlines, I want to express our sincere apologies for the treatment your children received." "Captain, I appreciate that," Darius acknowledged. "But an apology without understanding is meaningless. This isn't about hurt feelings. It's about a systemic problem." Frank Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we have protocols for verifying passenger seating." "Protocols that apparently only apply to certain passengers," Darius pointed out. "My children told me no other first-class passengers were asked to verify their seating assignments after boarding." The lead flight attendant had no response to this, knowing it was true. "The flight is now running 15 minutes behind schedule," Captain Phillips noted, checking his watch. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation after we reach San Francisco. I can arrange for customer relations representatives to meet us at the gate." "I understand you have a schedule to maintain, Captain," Darius said. "But some matters take precedence over on-time departures. I'd like to speak with someone from United's executive team now." Captain Phillips exchanged glances with Frank, both men recognizing that Darius Jackson wasn't someone whose concerns could be brushed aside with standard corporate placations. The captain nodded to Frank, who stepped away to make a call. While they waited, Melanie attempted to defend herself again. "Mr. Jackson, I've been with United for 15 years. I would never discriminate against anyone. I was simply doing my job, ensuring passengers are in their correct seats." "Ms. Ward," Darius replied, his gaze steady. "When you saw my children, two well-dressed, well-spoken black teenagers with valid first-class tickets, what was your first thought? What assumption led you to question their presence when you didn't question anyone else's?" Melanie's silence was answer enough. Frank returned with a tablet displaying a video call connection. On the screen was Laura Bennett, United Airlines Vice President of Customer Relations, a polished woman in her 50s with a concerned expression. "Mr. Jackson, I'm Laura Bennett. I understand there's been an unfortunate incident involving your children. On behalf of United Airlines, I want to—" "Ms. Bennett," Darius interjected calmly, "I appreciate you joining this conversation. But before we get to apologies, I want to be clear about what happened. My 17 and 15-year-old children were publicly humiliated, had their legitimate seating questioned multiple times, and had security called on them simply because they didn't fit someone's image of first-class passengers." Laura Bennett's professional veneer showed a crack of genuine concern. "That is completely unacceptable. I assure you this is not representative of United's values or policies." "Yet it happened," Darius pointed out. And I suspect it's happened before. At this point, another flight attendant, Jennifer Brooks, who had initially welcomed Terrence and Zoe aboard, stepped forward hesitantly. "Ma'am," she addressed Laura Bennett, "if I may, this isn't the first time there have been issues with Ms. Ward and passengers of color." The revelation hung in the air like a thundercloud. Melanie's face flushed deep red. "That's completely false," she sputtered. "Jennifer, you can't possibly." 2 months ago, with the Gonzalez family, Jennifer continued, her voice growing stronger. "And before that, the incident with Dr. Thompson from Atlanta." Laura Bennett's expression turned grave. "Ms. Brooks, thank you for speaking up. This information will be addressed appropriately." She turned her attention back to Darius. "Mr. Jackson, I want to assure you that we take this extremely seriously. We would like to offer your family our sincere apologies along with a full refund of your tickets and additional compensation for your trouble. Ms. Bennett," Darius said, shaking his head, "I'm not interested in free tickets or miles or whatever standard compensation package you're about to offer. What I want is accountability and systemic change." In the main cabin, passengers were becoming restless. An announcement had been made about technical difficulties causing the delay, but people were checking watches and sighing audibly. Captain Phillips felt the pressure of every minute the plane remained at the gate. "Mr. Jackson, I understand your concerns, but we have a plane full of passengers who are watching how you handle this situation," Darius finished for him. "Captain, I respect your position and responsibility to all passengers. But consider this. What message does it send if we simply smooth this over and take off?" The captain paused, genuinely considering the question. He was a man who prided himself on fairness and had risen through the ranks during a time when aviation was even less diverse than it was now. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in this conversation, the weight of Darius's words. Laura Bennett spoke up from the tablet screen. "Mr. Jackson, what specific actions would you like to see taken?" "First, Ms. Ward should not continue serving on this flight," Darius stated firmly. "Second, I want a detailed plan of how United intends to address racial bias in its training and protocols, not just a generic statement about diversity. And third, I want this documented properly, not buried in customer service records." Melanie looked as though she might protest but remained silent under Laura Bennett's stern gaze from the screen. "Those are reasonable requests," Laura acknowledged. "Ms. Ward will be reassigned, and I'll personally oversee the documentation of this incident. As for training and protocols, I'd welcome your input on how we can improve." Darius nodded, satisfied with this initial response. "I'm happy to have that conversation at the appropriate time. For now, I believe we've kept these passengers waiting long enough." As they prepared to conclude the impromptu meeting, Darius remembered something. "One more thing," he said, turning to Melanie. "Before you leave this flight, I'd like you to apologize to my children. Not to me. To them." The request clearly made Melanie uncomfortable, but with all eyes on her, including her superiors, she had little choice but to agree. As they exited the galley, Darius felt his phone vibrating with notifications. He glanced at the screen to see text messages from his chief of staff and head of PR. Somehow, word was already getting out. The incident had been filmed by multiple passengers, and social media was beginning to light up with the story of 2 black teenagers being removed from first class until their billionaire father intervened. This was no longer just about one family's experience on one flight. It was becoming a very public example of the everyday racism that persisted even for the children of one of the country's most successful black entrepreneurs. As he returned to the cabin where Terrence and Zoe waited, Darius knew that how they handled the next few hours would send a powerful message, not just to United Airlines, but to anyone watching about how to respond when confronted with the reality of racial bias in America. The first-class cabin had transformed into an arena of hushed whispers and sideways glances as Darius rejoined his children. Terrence and Zoe sat with the composed dignity their parents had instilled in them, despite the humiliation they'd endured. As their father approached, both teenagers straightened slightly. "What happened?" Terrence asked quietly as Darius took the seat across the aisle that a flight attendant had hurriedly cleared for him. "We're still working through it," Darius replied, keeping his voice low. "But first, I need to know what you two want." Zoe looked surprised. "What we want?" "Yes," Darius confirmed. "This happened to you. You have a say in how we respond." The siblings exchanged glances, having a silent conversation in the way only close siblings can. Terrence spoke first. "I want accountability," he said firmly. "Not just an apology, but real consequences. This can't keep happening to people who don't have a billionaire dad to step in." Zoe nodded in agreement but added, "I don't want this to become a huge public spectacle about us, though. This isn't about the Jackson family specifically. It's about something much bigger." Darius felt a surge of pride in his children's maturity and perspective. "You're both right. And I want you to know I support whatever approach you want to take." As they spoke, Captain Phillips approached their seats, his expression grave but respectful. "Mr. Jackson, we're facing increasing pressure from dispatch about our departure time. May I ask what you've decided?" Darius looked to his children again, giving them the space to contribute to the decision. Terrence straightened his shoulders. "We want to continue to San Francisco," he said. "But not without acknowledgement of what happened." Captain Phillips nodded. "Ms. Ward is being replaced for this flight. She would like to offer an apology before she departs." "In private or publicly?" Darius asked, though he already knew his children's preference. "I believe publicly would be appropriate," the captain replied, surprising them slightly. The incident wasn't private, after all. Meanwhile, other passengers were growing increasingly restless. The technical delay excuse was wearing thin as minutes ticked by. Some passengers from economy had begun to come forward to use the restrooms, creating a steady stream of curious onlookers who had heard fragments of what had occurred. From across the aisle, Gregory Wilson, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke. "Excuse me, Mr. Jackson." Darius turned, his expression neutral but questioning. "We've actually met before," Gregory said, extending his hand. "At the Chicago Technology Summit last year. I'm with Westfield Investments." Darius shook his hand with professional courtesy but waited for him to continue, sensing there was more. I saw what happened to your children," Gregory admitted, lowering his voice. "And I didn't say anything. I should have spoken up, and I didn't." The admission hung in the air between them, unexpectedly honest. "Why didn't you?" Darius asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. Gregory hesitated. "I told myself it wasn't my place. That I didn't have all the facts." He paused. "But the truth is, I was uncomfortable. It was easier to look away. That discomfort," Darius said quietly, "is a luxury my children don't have." Gregory nodded, absorbing the weight of this statement. "I understand that now. Or at least, I'm trying to. What can I do?" "Recognize that your silence in moments like these is a choice," Darius replied. "And it's a choice that reinforces the status quo." Their conversation was interrupted as Laura Bennett's voice came through the airplane's communication system. She had patched in remotely to address the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Laura Bennett, Vice President of Customer Relations at United Airlines. I want to apologize for the delay in your departure. We've had a situation that required immediate attention, involving the inappropriate treatment of 2 of our young passengers. United Airlines does not condone discrimination of any kind, and we are taking immediate steps to address what occurred. We appreciate your patience as we resolve this matter." The announcement created a fresh wave of murmurs throughout the cabin. Some passengers looked confused, while others who had witnessed the incident nodded in understanding. Melanie Ward then appeared at the front of the first-class cabin, her face flushed but her posture professional. She approached Terrence and Zoe directly. "I want to apologize for my behavior," she said, her voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I made assumptions that were unfair and unfounded. I'm sorry for the discomfort and embarrassment I caused you both." The apology was clearly difficult for her to deliver, but whether it stemmed from genuine remorse or professional necessity remained unclear. Terrence and Zoe accepted the apology with gracious nods, demonstrating a maturity beyond their years. As Melanie left the aircraft, Jennifer Brooks took over as the first-class cabin's primary attendant. Captain Phillips returned to address Darius. "Mr. Jackson, United's executive team has agreed to your conditions. They'll be implementing a review of training procedures regarding implicit bias, and this incident will be formally documented with their commitment to substantive changes." "Thank you, Captain," Darius replied. "We appreciate your handling of this situation." As the captain returned to the cockpit to prepare for their now-delayed departure, Darius found himself facing another decision. His phone was buzzing constantly with notifications. The incident had already gone viral, with hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #FirstClassWhileBlack trending. His PR team was requesting guidance on how to respond to media inquiries that were already flooding in. "Dad," Zoe said, noticing his preoccupation with his phone. "What's happening out there?" Darius showed his children the social media storm that was brewing. "This is becoming bigger than just us. How do you want to handle it?" Before either teenager could respond, Darius received a call from Nathan Turner, his former college roommate who was now a prominent civil rights attorney in San Francisco. "Darius," Nathan said when he answered. "I'm seeing what's happening. I'm already at SFO waiting for your arrival. We need to talk about this, it's an opportunity to push for real change." As Darius considered his friend's words, he looked at his children, who had endured public humiliation with remarkable composure. He thought about all the other black travelers who faced similar treatment without the protection of wealth or status. He thought about how little had changed since his own youth, despite all the supposed progress. The decision crystallized in his mind. This wouldn't be swept under the rug with corporate apologies and private settlements. This would be a moment of accountability and, hopefully, meaningful change. "We'll see you at the gate, Nathan," Darius confirmed. "And yes, we have much to discuss." As the plane finally began its pushback from the gate, nearly 40 minutes behind schedule, Darius settled into his seat across from his children. The three Jacksons exchanged looks of understanding and resolve. What had begun as a routine flight to a summer program had transformed into something much more significant, a public stand against the everyday indignities that continued to plague Black Americans, regardless of their achievements or status. The decision had been made. This wouldn't be the end of the story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter, not just for the Jackson family, but potentially for an entire system that needed to change. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Phillips speaking. We've resolved our ground delay and are now en route to San Francisco. Our flight time today will be approximately 5 hours and 45 minutes. We apologize for the late departure and thank you for your patience. The captain's voice over the intercom was steady and professional, giving no indication of the drama that had unfolded at the gate. As the plane reached cruising altitude, a strange new atmosphere settled over the first-class cabin, a mixture of awkwardness, curiosity, and in some cases, newfound respect. Jennifer Brooks, now the lead flight attendant for first class, approached the Jackson family with genuine warmth. "Can I get you anything to drink?" she asked, her manner natural and respectful. "Sparkling water for me, please," Darius replied. "Same," said Terrence, while Zoe requested apple juice. As Jennifer moved away to prepare their drinks, Darius leaned across the aisle toward his children. "You both handled yourselves exceptionally well," he said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Terrence's expression remained serious. "I kept thinking about what you and Mom always say, that we represent something bigger than ourselves." "We do," Darius confirmed. "But that doesn't make it fair that you have to be perfect in moments like these." Zoe looked out the window at the clouds below. "I almost lost it when they called security," she admitted. "I was so angry." You had every right to be, her father assured her. Controlling that anger doesn't mean you shouldn't feel it. A few rows ahead, Sofia Martinez, who had spoken up in their defense earlier, turned in her seat to address them. "Excuse me," she said. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened. It was completely unacceptable." "Thank you for speaking up," Darius replied sincerely. "It matters when people say something." Sophia nodded. "I've been on the receiving end of similar treatment. Not exactly the same, but..." She trailed off, then added, "I should have been more forceful in my objection." "You did more than most," Terrence pointed out, gesturing subtly around the cabin where several passengers now seemed keenly interested in their books, tablets, or the view outside, anywhere but meeting the eyes of the Jackson family. The conversation with Sophia opened a small floodgate. Over the next hour, several passengers approached to express their support or apologize for not intervening. Some interactions were genuinely meaningful, while others felt more like attempts to absolve personal guilt. Darius navigated each one with the diplomatic skill that had helped him build his business empire, while Terrence and Zoe observed and occasionally contributed. Perhaps the most surprising visitor was Clara Henderson, the elderly woman who had chatted with them at the airport coffee shop. She made her way from economy class, stopping by their seats with a gentle smile. "I heard what happened from another passenger," she explained. "I just wanted to check on you too. Are you all right?" "We're fine, Ms. Henderson, thank you," Zoe replied, touched by the woman's genuine concern. "Well, it's a disgrace how you were treated," Clara stated firmly. "In my 82 years, I've seen too much of this kind of thing. You'd think we would have learned by now." After Clara returned to her seat, Darius's phone buzzed with another call. This time it was from Captain Phillips, asking if Darius could come to the cockpit for a brief conversation. Such invitations were rare in the post-9/11 era of aviation, but not unheard of for VIP passengers. In the cockpit, Captain Phillips offered Darius a seat in the observer's chair. "Mr. Jackson, I wanted to speak with you privately. First, to apologize again for what happened. I appreciate that, Captain. But also," Phillips continued, his voice more personal than it had been during the confrontation, "I wanted you to know that your handling of the situation made an impression on me." Darius raised an eyebrow questioningly. "I've been flying for 35 years, the captain explained. I've seen incidents like this before, maybe not as blatant, but similar. Usually, they get smoothed over. The airline offers miles or upgrades, everyone moves on, and nothing changes." He paused, looking out at the vast sky before them. "I have 2 grandchildren who are biracial. My daughter married a wonderful man who happens to be black. And I think about the world they're growing up in." Phillips turned back to Darius. "What I'm trying to say is, I'm glad you didn't let this slide. The industry needs the push." The conversation gave Darius a new perspective on the captain, who had initially seemed more concerned with maintaining schedule than addressing discrimination. People were complex, their motivations and beliefs not always immediately apparent. When Darius returned to the cabin, he found Terrence engaged in conversation with Gregory Wilson, the businessman who had admitted his failure to speak up earlier. "Your father mentioned you're interested in blockchain applications for supply chain verification," Gregory was saying. "That's actually my specialty at Westfield. We're developing systems for pharmaceutical authentication." Terrence nodded. "I've been researching similar applications for food safety in developing regions. The challenge is implementing it with limited internet infrastructure." Darius observed the interaction with interest. His son was networking and discussing technological innovations while simultaneously processing the trauma of racial profiling, a complicated balancing act that black professionals navigated daily. Meanwhile, Zoe was working on her tablet, occasionally looking up to contribute to conversations but mostly focused on what appeared to be coding work. When Darius asked what she was doing, she turned the screen toward him. "I'm creating an app," she explained. It would let people document and report incidents of discrimination in consumer settings, airlines, restaurants, stores, hotels. With location tagging, pattern recognition, and direct reporting to corporate headquarters. Darius studied the mock-up his 15-year-old had created in just the short time since the incident. "This is impressive, Zoe. You're channeling that anger into something constructive." "I learned that from you and Mom," she replied. "When you started the technology education initiative in Detroit after that venture capital firm said no one from your neighborhood would ever create anything valuable." The memory brought a smile to Darius's face. That rejection had indeed fueled one of his most successful philanthropic ventures, which had now helped thousands of underprivileged students pursue careers in technology. As the flight progressed, Darius's phone continued to buzz with notifications. The video of the incident had gone viral, with over 1 million views across various platforms. News outlets were picking up the story, and United Airlines had issued an official statement promising a full investigation. Nathan Turner, his attorney friend, sent updates about the growing social media response and suggestions for how to leverage this moment for maximum impact. Darius's PR team had prepared several statement options, awaiting his approval. But amid all the external chaos, Darius found himself reflecting on a similar incident from 20 years earlier, before he had wealth or influence. He'd been removed from a restaurant where he was meeting clients, the manager insisting there must be some mistake because those tables are reserved for business meetings. There had been no viral videos then, no corporate apologies. Just another indignity to swallow in pursuit of his goals. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Jennifer Brooks approached with a message from the cockpit. "Captain Phillips asked me to inform you that there will be media at the gate." Apparently, the story has gained significant attention. Darius thanked her for the warning and turned to his children. "This is about to become very public. Are you prepared for that?" Terrence and Zoe exchanged glances before Terrence spoke. "If it helps change things, even a little, then yes." Zoe nodded in agreement. "Besides," she added with a hint of her mother's determination, "we have nothing to be ashamed of. We did nothing wrong." "No," Darius agreed, feeling a surge of pride in his children's resilience and clarity. "You certainly didn't." As the aircraft touched down at San Francisco International Airport, the Jackson family prepared to face not just the waiting media, but the opportunity to transform an all-too-common experience of discrimination into a catalyst for meaningful change. The jetway at San Francisco International Airport resembled a press conference more than an arrival gate. As soon as the Jacksons emerged, camera flashes erupted and reporters called out questions. Airport security officers maintained a perimeter, allowing passengers to exit but keeping the media at bay. Standing just beyond the journalists was Nathan Turner, Darius's former college roommate and now one of the country's most respected civil rights attorneys. At 6'4" with salt and pepper hair and wireframe glasses, Nathan cut an imposing figure. He raised a hand in greeting, signaling to Darius that he was ready when they were. "Remember," Darius said quietly to his children as they paused just inside the jetway, "you don't have to say anything if you don't want to. This isn't your burden to carry." "We know, Dad," Terrence replied. "But like you always say, with privilege comes responsibility." Zoe adjusted her backpack strap with determination. "I'm ready." With that, the Jackson family stepped forward to face the waiting cameras. Nathan immediately moved to join them, creating a protective barrier between the family and the most aggressive reporters. "Mr. Jackson will make a brief statement," Nathan announced, his voice carrying the authority of decades in courtrooms. "Please hold your questions until the end." Darius stepped forward, his posture straight but not rigid, his expression serious but composed, the same presence that had carried him through countless board meetings and investor presentations. "Today, my children experienced something that happens to Black Americans every day," he began. "They were assumed not to belong in a space because of the color of their skin. They were questioned, doubted, and ultimately had security called on them despite having every right to be where they were." He paused, letting the words sink in. "What makes this story newsworthy isn't that it happened. It's newsworthy because my position gave me the power to demand accountability in the moment. But for every story like ours that makes headlines, there are thousands that don't, because most people don't have the protection that wealth and status provide. Cameras clicked rapidly as Darius continued. United Airlines has apologized and committed to reviewing their training procedures. We appreciate that first step. But this isn't about one airline or one incident. This is about the persistent reality of navigating America while black. As Darius spoke, a group of United Airlines executives waited nervously nearby. Laura Bennett, the VP of Customer Relations who had joined the earlier conversation remotely, had flown in from Chicago on another flight specifically to address the situation in person. Now she stood with the airport station manager and two other corporate representatives, watching the impromptu press conference unfold. After finishing his statement, Darius allowed a few questions, answering with measured precision. When asked if they planned to sue the airline, Nathan stepped forward. The Jacksons aren't interested in financial compensation, the attorney clarified. They're interested in systemic change. We're in discussions with United about substantive reforms to their training, hiring, and accountability practices. As the press conference concluded, Laura Bennett approached with her colleagues. Mr. Jackson, might we continue our conversation somewhere more private? Darius agreed, and the group moved to United's premium lounge, which had been cleared of other passengers for this purpose. There, Laura presented a more comprehensive response to the incident than had been possible during the crisis on the aircraft. We've placed Ms. Ward on administrative leave pending a full investigation, she explained. But more importantly, we've initiated an external audit of our customer service training with a focus on implicit bias. What impressed Darius wasn't just the immediate action but the fact that Laura had come prepared with data, statistics on customer complaints related to potential discrimination, broken down by demographics, routes, and employee teams. We've been tracking these incidents, she admitted, but not addressing the patterns effectively. Your experience has forced us to confront that failure. While the adults discussed policy changes, Terrence and Zoe sat slightly apart, processing the day's events in their own ways. Terrence was exchanging texts with friends who had seen the videos online, while Zoe continued refining her app concept, now with renewed purpose. Across social media platforms, #FirstClassWhileBlack was trending nationally. The videos of the incident had been viewed over 10 million times, with celebrities, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens sharing their own similar experiences. Major news networks had picked up the story, framing it as a high-profile example of the everyday racism that persisted despite claims of progress. What no one had anticipated was how quickly the scrutiny would expand beyond United. By evening, passengers on other airlines began sharing their own stories of discrimination under the hashtag, creating a broader conversation about race and travel. Competing airlines, sensing both a PR opportunity and a potential vulnerability, began issuing statements about their own diversity initiatives and training programs. The financial impact was immediate and measurable. United stock dropped 4% by market close, representing hundreds of millions in market capitalization. Analysts cited concerns about potential boycotts and the cost of implementing new training and oversight mechanisms. As dinner time approached, the Jacksons finally extricated themselves from the meetings and media to have a private meal with Nathan at a nearby restaurant. Over plates of barely touched food, they discussed the legal and social implications of the day's events. The videos changed everything, Nathan explained. 20 years ago, this would have been your word against theirs, and guess who most people would have believed? Even with video evidence, there are still people online saying we overreacted, Terrence pointed out, having made the mistake of reading comments on social media. There always will be, Nathan acknowledged. But what matters is that the evidence forced a conversation that might not have happened otherwise. Darius's phone rang, Alicia calling from London. He stepped away from the table to update his wife on the situation. Though he tried to downplay the emotional impact, Alicia knew her children too well to be fooled. Put them on, she insisted. I need to see their faces. When Terrence and Zoe spoke with their mother via video call, her calm strength helped center them after the tumultuous day. Alicia Jackson, with her background in human rights law, offered a perspective that balanced righteous anger with strategic action. Channel this experience, she advised them. Use it to fuel your purpose, not just your pain. After dinner, Nathan outlined the approach he recommended for maximizing the impact of this moment. We create an independent review board, he suggested. Not just for United, but as an industry standard. Real oversight with teeth, transparency requirements, and concrete benchmarks. You think they'll agree to that? Darius asked skeptically. They don't have much choice, Nathan replied. The alternative is legislation, which would be messier and potentially less effective. This gives them the chance to get ahead of it, to appear proactive rather than reactive. As they discussed strategy late into the night, what became increasingly clear was that this incident had the potential to create ripples far beyond one family's experience on one flight. It had opened a window into the persistent reality of racial bias in America, a reality that continued to surprise many white Americans while being painfully familiar to Black Americans regardless of their social or economic status. By the next morning, the story had evolved further. Other Black executives had begun coming forward with their own stories, creating a powerful narrative about how even the most successful Black Americans continued to face assumptions about where they belonged and didn't belong. What had started as a humiliating experience for two teenagers was transforming into something much larger, a moment of national reckoning about the gap between America's stated ideals and its lived realities. And the Jackson family found themselves at the center of it all, navigating not just their personal processing of the event but also the responsibility of using this spotlight effectively to push for genuine change. As Darius watched his children prepare for their Stanford program orientation, seemingly unfazed but undoubtedly carrying the weight of yesterday's events, he felt both immense pride in their resilience and deep sadness that such resilience was still necessary for Black children in America. You know, Zoe said quietly as they prepared to leave their hotel, I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't boarded that plane when you did. The question hung in the air, unanswered because they all knew the truth. Without Darius Jackson's wealth and status as protection, his children would have simply become two more Black teenagers with a story of discrimination that most of America would never hear. 6 months later, Darius Jackson stood at the podium in the Grand Ballroom of the Chicago Marriott, addressing the first National Aviation Diversity Summit, an event that hadn't existed before the incident involving his children. Progress isn't just about avoiding lawsuits or protecting brand reputation, he told the assembled executives, government officials, and industry leaders. It's about transforming our fundamental assumptions about who belongs where. The audience included representatives from every major airline, the FAA, consumer advocacy groups, and, most significantly, a newly formed independent oversight board dedicated to tracking and addressing discrimination in air travel. In the front row sat Terrence and Zoe, now fixtures at these kinds of events but still focused primarily on their education and projects. Terrence had just received early acceptance to MIT, while Zoe had continued refining her discrimination reporting app, which had secured seed funding from a tech incubator. True transformation, Darius continued, requires both accountability and opportunity. Accountability for patterns of bias, and opportunity for those previously excluded to help shape the solutions. As he spoke, slides displayed behind him showed concrete changes implemented across the industry since the incident. United Airlines had instituted comprehensive anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff, with refresher courses required quarterly. They'd also created a new executive position, Chief Inclusion Officer, and hired a respected diversity consultant to fill it. But perhaps most significantly, the airline had implemented a transparent reporting system for potential discrimination incidents, with quarterly public reports on numbers, resolutions, and policy changes. Other major carriers had quickly followed suit rather than appear less committed to addressing the issue. After concluding his remarks to a standing ovation, Darius joined his children for the networking reception. As they made their way through the crowd, they encountered several familiar faces from Flight 1143. Jennifer Brooks, the flight attendant who had spoken up about previous incidents, had been promoted to a new position as a diversity training coordinator. She greeted the family warmly. "Your courage changed everything," she told them. "Not just for passengers, but for employees like me who saw problems but felt powerless to address them." More surprising was the presence of Melanie Ward. After her suspension and the subsequent investigation, she had been required to complete extensive sensitivity training and community service with organizations serving communities of color. Rather than resign in humiliation, she had chosen a different path, working with the airline's inclusion team to share her experience as a cautionary tale for other employees. When she approached the Jacksons, there was an understandable moment of tension. "I want to thank you," she said directly to Terrence and Zoe, her voice carrying a humility that hadn't been present during their first encounter. "Not for forgiveness, which I haven't earned, but for creating a moment that forced me to confront biases I didn't even realize I carried." The teenagers acknowledged her words with polite nods, neither embracing a narrative of easy reconciliation nor holding on to resentment. They had learned from their parents that transformative justice wasn't about performative forgiveness but about changed behavior and systems. Across the room, Gregory Wilson was engaged in conversation with Captain Phillips. The businessman who had admitted his failure to speak up during the incident had partnered with Darius on a corporate accountability initiative, leveraging his position in the investment world to pressure companies to adopt meaningful diversity metrics tied to executive compensation. Meanwhile, Clara Henderson, the elderly woman who had shown kindness to Terrence and Zoe at the airport, had become an unexpected ally. Her viral blog post about witnessing the incident, titled, "What I Saw and What I Should Have Done," had resonated particularly with older white Americans who considered themselves progressive but rarely intervened in moments of injustice. Now in her 80s, Clara had become a sought-after speaker on the topic of active allyship, bringing her perspective as someone who had lived through the civil rights era but recognized how much work remained undone. As the evening wound down, Darius received a text from Alicia, who was attending a water rights conference in Geneva but had been watching the summit's live stream. "So proud of all of you," she wrote. "Change happens one system at a time." The Jackson Family Foundation had launched a scholarship program for minority students pursuing careers in aviation, not just as pilots but as aerospace engineers, safety specialists, and executives. The first cohort of 20 scholars was set to begin their studies the following fall. Later that night, back in their hotel suite, the family reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. "I never thought one flight could lead to all this," Terrence said, loosening his tie and collapsing onto the sofa. Now 18, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced public scrutiny and emerged stronger. "It wasn't just one flight though, was it?" Zoe pointed out. "It was all the flights before ours where people didn't have the power to demand change. All those stories that never made headlines." Darius nodded, thinking about how his children had grown from this experience, not just in their understanding of racial dynamics in America, but in their commitment to using their privilege to create pathways for others. "What you both experienced that day was wrong," he said. "But I'm incredibly proud of how you've transformed it into something meaningful." 2 weeks later, the Jackson family boarded another United flight, this time all together. The difference in the experience was subtle but significant, not just in how they were treated, but in the visible diversity of the flight crew and the new training materials visible at the gate agent stations. As they settled into their first-class seats without question or second glances, Darius reflected on the paradox of progress. This moment of normalcy, of simply being able to exist in a space without having to justify their presence, represented both a small personal victory and a reminder of how much further society had to go. The flight attendant, a young black woman named Tasha Jones, recognized them immediately but treated them with the same professional courtesy she showed all passengers. "It's an honor to serve you today," she said quietly as she offered pre-takeoff beverages. "My younger brother just received one of your foundation's aviation scholarships." As the plane took off, Darius watched his children, Terrence absorbed in reading about MIT's latest research initiatives, Zoe sketching new interface designs for her app. Despite everything they had experienced and the public attention they had navigated, they remained focused on their own paths forward. The true transformation, Darius realized, wasn't just in policies or training programs or oversight boards, though those structural changes were essential. The deeper transformation was in expectations, both for what was acceptable in how people were treated and for what was possible when that treatment was challenged. As Alicia often reminded them, quoting Frederick Douglass, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." Their family had been uniquely positioned to make that demand in a way that couldn't be ignored. The responsibility now was to continue using that position to hold open doors for others, to transform not just one incident but the systems that made such incidents commonplace. 6 months after being questioned, challenged, and nearly removed from their rightful seats, Terrence and Zoe Jackson flew without incident, not because they were recognized as the children of a billionaire, but because the standards for how passengers were treated had begun, slowly but meaningfully, to change. And that transformation, however incomplete and ongoing, represented something powerful, not just what could happen when a black CEO changed everything for his own children, but what might be possible when that same determination was applied to changing everything for everyone's children. This story illustrates the uncomfortable truth that racial discrimination persists regardless of wealth or status. The Jackson family's experience reveals how privilege functions in America. While money couldn't prevent discrimination, it provided Darius the power to demand accountability when it occurred. Most importantly, it demonstrates that individual incidents of racism aren't isolated events but symptoms of systemic problems requiring systemic solutions. True change demands both personal courage and institutional reform. Speaking up matters, whether you're directly affected like Terrence and Zoe, an ally like Sophia and Clara, or someone who initially stayed silent like Gregory. Silence perpetuates injustice, action disrupts it. The transformation we witnessed wasn't merely about one airline's policies but about challenging fundamental assumptions about who belongs in which spaces. By refusing to accept superficial apologies and demanding substantive change, the Jacksons transformed their humiliation into a catalyst for progress that benefited countless others. Perhaps the most powerful lesson is that change happens when we channel righteous anger into constructive action, using privilege to create pathways for those without it and holding institutions accountable not just for intentions but for measurable outcomes. What discrimination have you witnessed or experienced that could have been prevented through better awareness and training? Share your story in the comments below. If this narrative resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories about confronting racism and creating meaningful change. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, whether they've experienced discrimination or have the power to prevent it. Thank you for listening, and remember that your voice matters in the ongoing work of building a more just society where everyone is treated with dignity regardless of their appearance.